Good evening, everyone. It's 6:30, and I know that we'll have people coming in because traffic's terrible in the Twin Cities right now. Every day it seems to get worse, and I don't know how that's humanly possible. But welcome. My name is Carrie Morgan, and I'm the gallery director here at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and I'm happy that you're here tonight. Tonight we are going to be welcoming 4 accomplished artists to Minnesota: Marjorie Amdur, Matthew Bourbon, Caroline Kent, and Janine Nagy. And now that Caroline has decamped to the windier climes of Chicago, none of these artists currently call our state home. And we do still miss you, Caroline. But I want to, before we begin, I want to acknowledge our state's history, our Minnesota history, which came into being only through the forced removal and the destruction of Native communities over the course of our nation's history. I want to take a moment to reflect upon the fact that the land that we are using to share space this evening was once home to the Dakota people. Now I would like to introduce Kenneth Steinbach, professor of art at Bethel University and moderator of this evening's panel. A graduate of Bethel and the Cranbrook Academy of Art, Kenneth has been a professor for over 25 years and currently teaches classes in sculpture, three-dimensional visual thinking, a senior seminar in art, and creative practices. And it was out of his long engagement with students and concern for their ongoing success that he set out to write the book, Creative Practices for Visual Artists: Time, Space, Process. This book, which was many years in the making, was published last year by Routledge Press and is intended, quote, to help artists develop healthy and authentic practices in light of new challenges, unquote. The stories and the insights that Kenneth shares are the results of having interviewed 75 successful mid-career artists from different parts of the world and asking them about how they lived and worked, what they read, and how they developed their practices. There is no magic formula for sustaining an artistic life, as this book attests, but there is much wisdom and pleasure in learning from so many other points of view. So I will unabashedly invite you all to read the book. Now, Kenneth's own artwork speaks to personal and cultural histories that are continually updated, altered, and discarded. His recent investigations have focused on works that explore the history of failed and discarded fiat currencies, turning imagery extrapolated from these currencies into large field drawings, installations, and prints. He is the recipient of several grants from the Minnesota State Arts Board and grants in direct support of his work and research from Bethel University. Some of his recent exhibits include The Voice of the People at the Trierkit Center for Printmaking in Bergen, Norway, Transmissions at Blue Star Museum in San Antonio, and Mappa Mundi at the Silverwood Park Gallery in Minneapolis. He also shows his work at Circa Gallery and also at Forming Content. Kenneth is also the recipient of the 2014 Arlen G. Mayer Award in Visual Art from the Lilly Foundation, a Faculty Excellent Award in Teaching, and the Erdgren Scholars Grant from Bethel University. I also want to thank that we're here tonight because of Michelle Westmark, who is the gallery director at Bethel, and she came asking a whole host of us gallery directors who work at academic spaces if we'd be interested in creating exhibitions that build upon the ideas and concept behind Kenneth's book. Luckily, 4 institutions came forward, and I wish there even had been more, because I think out of 75 artists that can interview, there could have been exhibitions across the Twin Cities and the whole state of Minnesota that would have been incredibly dynamic, so maybe we'll do that another time. But currently, there's 4 exhibitions in the Twin Cities. There's one at Augsburg College, there's one at Bethel University, 2 shows at St. Kate's University, and 1 at MCAT. And so I do hope that you'll have the chance to visit them all. Marjorie Amdur's show closes this week, as does both Caroline Kent's and Melanie Pankow's show at St. Kate's. So time is of the essence. I hope you get to those shows. And now, with further ado, I'll turn this over to Kenneth. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming, everyone. This is fun to see friendly faces out there. So, I think I would like to first say thanks to Carrie Morgan and again to Michelle Westmark-Wingard, Jenny Wheatley, and Nicole Watson for their work putting together the exhibits associated with the book, and also for this discussion. In a perfect world, every writer would have such an enthusiastic team. So if you would just keep this going for me, that would be really great. I think it's pretty safe to say that without them, I certainly could have not pulled this off. Let's just be clear about that. So I thought it would be helpful to take about 15 minutes to offer a brief overview of the research in the book for those of you that maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet, which I'm assuming is probably most of you. It's my goal to have most of our time tonight spent in conversation with the panelists, but I do think it would be helpful to maybe set it up a little bit, talk a bit about the history and some of the major themes that emerged. So, several years ago, I pitched a class to my colleagues at Bethel University that would require students to do all those things our teachers wish that our students would do, but they don't, even when we twist arms, things that they just are reluctant to do. That would be things like looking up an instructor, looking up another artist online, doing a little speculative research, or maybe investigating a promising direction that might have emerged in their work. While faculty often will suggest this in critiques or reviews, students over the years, it seemed to me, have increasingly been less inclined to believe in the value of that. Anecdotally, and just in sort of talking with students conversationally afterwards, I found that more and more they were doing less and less of this kind of thing that we asked them to do. Furthermore, about that same time, over the past, about the same few years, I started noticing a shift in about how students talked about their education. While I had been leading, critiques and conversations with students, as Carrie said, for a long time, suddenly I was finding in conversations with students words like successful and value had very different meanings than I had given them. Students had one set of meanings, I had a different set of meanings for them. When I would talk about the success of an artwork, I would be referring to expressive or formal properties, but more and more students talking about success tended to be talking about meeting project requirements. Obviously, there was a huge emphasis on grades that were emerging at that time. It was clear that much of the shift in student perspectives were related to changes in our educational system, K-12 educational system, that can really be pegged right back to the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. A conversation that I'm sure that many of you in this room have had to some degree or another with your colleagues. So I wanted to teach this class that addressed these issues. And my colleagues somehow agreed to this very vague proposal that I had, very grateful to that. And so I jumped in, did a bunch of research, read a very tall stack of books, and plunged into this thing, taught it for a couple years. But after a couple years, I realized that a lot of what I was teaching was actually a mixture of things that I had inherited as a student, as a teacher, elements of my own experience as an artist, and bits and pieces from conversations with other teachers, all of which, when assembled, was frankly a lot less coherent than I thought it was, when I started, and certainly a lot less coherent than I had thought it should be. And I wanted to do something different. And so I would say that actually this project, this book, and all this research actually emerged not out of my strengths as a teacher, but out of my weaknesses. I found I really didn't know what I was doing to a certain degree, and I wanted to change that. So I thought, well, I'll go back to the source. So I found some artists that I knew. I thought, I'm going to find some folks. I'm going to, have long conversations. I'm going to figure this thing out. So I had conversations with about a dozen artists, figuring that would be I'll get it then. After a dozen artists, it was even worse. I didn't know how to do this thing. That wasn't helpful. Completely contradictory all over the place. It's really, really problematic. These are not going to help me out. And so I realized that if I was going to really sort it, I needed to talk to a lot more artists. And I eventually ended up interviewing 75 artists. At some point in the middle there, a book sort of emerged. I got a contract for a book, and so here we are. And I was happy to report that actually I did find some consensus after all of these interviews, and I did come to some conclusions. But to talk a little bit about some of those artists, people often ask me, how did you select them? What are the basis for that? I would say I had some sort of objective criteria for selecting the artists that I talked to. I wanted them to be out of school for at least a decade, so they weren't making their teachers' work. They were making their own. I wanted them to have some form of either critical, commercial, or success working with groups. For the most part, I was able to achieve that. Forms of diversity were also super important. including geographic, cultural, racial diversity. About a quarter of the artists I ended up interviewing by the end actually reside outside the US. I was super happy about that. And the great majority were outside the cultural centers of New York and LA, as indeed are most artists. I wanted to talk to people that were connected to, that would be good role models for students that I was teaching. For the most part, I was able to achieve demographics that mirror some of the national demographic makeup. Not always, but I came pretty close. And I always also wanted to hit like a lot of diversity in terms of media, expected audience, and expressive voice. So just a broad range. Other criteria that I had were actually a lot less subjective. Frankly, I wanted to talk with people that kind of intimidated me a little bit. So there you go. So, people whose work I was a little envious of. You know, it's like, wow, I wish I could do that kind of thing, or there's something there that I really love, or, you know, this person has like a much better career than I am having. So there you go. And so I did that almost always, and almost all the time I didn't know the people ahead of time, which actually ended up being really helpful. Probably another aspect that was really important was I wanted to select people that were not just about gallery sales, that people who had some kind of connection to a larger community. They were doing something either in their practice or their work or their larger life that was like socially engaged. It's like, that's the thing that I want. I don't want people to just crank out more product. I want to talk to people who seem to have this larger life thing kind of figured out relative to their artwork. One of the things, and so I was able to talk to a lot of people that fit all of that, and it was really great. The great majority of successful artists, this is one thing that was revealed. One of the things that emerged a lot was that the people that I were talking to were not just subjects, but they were like insanely well informed about this thing I was really interested in. So what I was finding was I wasn't really talking to subjects, I was talking to collaborators. And I really believe that probably, you know, I don't put a number on it, but a lot of the people that I interviewed could have easily written this book. They were just like, they're deeply invested, they were sharp, they were concise, they knew what they were doing, and there was a high level of self-awareness, which was really fun. And so most of the time, as I was talking to people, I was finding a lot of the ideas that emerged and that ended up in the book were emerging in the conversations, which was terrific. So, oh, lost my place, hold on. The goal of this research was not to define a prescriptive path for successful art making. I want to be clear about that. I didn't want to try to come up with a recipe. I didn't want to come up with a silver bullet. You know, do this thing and you'll be super successful as an artist. I really am deeply skeptical of those kinds of approaches. The goal was to outline, here we go, a constellation of activities that most artists engage in most of the time that supports long-term artistic practice. Then, to interpret and focus those conclusions toward a group of people whose creative capabilities have been systematically impoverished by educational environments that emphasize predetermined outcomes, efficiency, conclusive statements, and accessible goals. It was pretty specific. So I wanted to, not only did I want to learn this stuff, I wanted to roll it up into a ball and I wanted to pitch it toward this demographic. This demographic also is further challenged by an increasingly digital environment. I would say this demographic, like all of us here, are challenged by an increasingly digital environment that tends to implement and shape visual content in very marketable ways. That has a big impact on us too, that I don't think we've really accounted for. A third sort of minor goal, but very impactful, also is the high cost of college. You ever think about how high cost of college impacts our students' ability to develop a strong practice? I think it has a profound effect, and we don't really talk about that very much. So there are some ideas that emerged. And get these two apart, be able to talk about them. There were like 5 or 6 bigger ideas that I came to believe about how this works. And specifically, that could be pointed towards a demographic that has really unique and specific challenges. The first, people talk a lot about space, so I'm going to say space is a really big thing. It's necessary to carve out forms of space in order to work. And actually what I would say is that it's one of the single biggest indicators of a successful practice. I can sort of prove this statistically if you're interested in that. One of the single biggest indicators of whether somebody's successful or not is how they approach their studio time. It's like if they go into the studio, only walk into the studio when they have something to make, they make the thing and then walk out when they're done, they're probably not going to last very long and they're probably not going to be very successful. Successful artists clock in the time, whether it's 8 to noon every day of the week, right? Or whether it's 8, if they have kids, that's 8 at night until midnight, that sort of framework is a profoundly different, those two different ideas are profoundly different in terms of what they produce for the artist, how the artist works, and how the artist is able to do what they do. It's huge. It almost can't be overstated. There are some other things, too, that also are impactful about space, and that include not just physical spaces, but here's a curious thing. An important aspect of space is that it's important to create spaces where the individual is free from observation and critique. There are actually several studies that show that simply observing people while they're making things, like literally the act of sort of hovering while they're making things, causes them to generate poorer ideas and take more time to do it. Boy, how does that fit into academia? A second idea that emerged that I think was really important was about the value of research, in particular embodied research, which I'll talk about in a second. Analytical left brain research, things like facts, reading history, understanding information, is clearly part of any activity and certainly is part of artistic practice. Embodied research, however, are investigations that connect us personally and physically in our work and allows the artist to dwell with their ideas in subjective ways. I find myself using this phrase a lot, dwell with. Subjective or embodied research is about learning to dwell with the thing that you're interested in. How do we sort of hang out with the things that we want to learn about? Successful artists find ways to connect with their subject matter in these experiential and interpretive experiences. Embodied research can include things like interviews, conversations with other artists, other people about what you're doing, drawings of sites, travel, location visits, repeating photograph of your subject matter, and so on. It was not unusual in these interviews to find artists talking about reading the same books over and over again or drawing the same ideas repeatedly. Or taking pilgrimages, repeated pilgrimages to specific sites. These two different forms of analytical and sort of dwelling with research, statistically speaking, if I could drop another number in here, are really important to the degree that most really successful artists who typically, by the way, work between 20 and 25 hours a week. That's a funny thing to put out there, but I'll give you that one for free, okay? That most successful artists work between 20 and 25 hours a week. It's that's like brush on canvas production. So what are they doing the rest of the time? Well, what they're doing is about a quarter and a half of that artist's time. So if a person is working 20 hours a week painting, they're also spending between 4 to 8 hours a week in this kind of research, dwelling with activities, actual research production. So for a typical artist, they're spending 1 day a week doing these kinds of things, hanging out with their ideas, hanging out with material, reading things, contemplating, dwelling with their painting, sitting in the studio, just looking at what they're doing. This is really valuable stuff. It's like, wow, how does that fit into academia? Like, do we give our students a lot of time to do that? It's like, I don't think we really do very often. Another thing, we hear a lot of talk about failure. Failure is super important. A thing that I would say about failure, however, is that telling a student in our current educational system, don't be afraid to fail. We hear this all the time, don't be afraid to fail, don't be afraid to fail. But telling a student that in an educational environment without giving them the space to do that is like a form of crazy making. You can't really do that. It's like telling them to grow a third arm. It's like, it's just not possible to say, don't be afraid to fail, and then sort of penalizing students for failing. So they have very little educational experience that would reinforce the value of this. So it's necessary to, I think it's necessary to sort of change this environment. So as you are working, that students, have the capability, they have the space so that when they do fail, they're not penalized for it. It actually became a really big part of the class. I can talk about that later if you want. So, likewise, different types of conflict can introduce important new content into our practice that we would not have otherwise considered. Anxiety, for example, is something that none of us like. I was nervous here 20 minutes before we started. Didn't really like it very much. Told Carrie, my wife, I wish I was somewhere else right now. So, but here we are. So, however, anxiety is a highly accurate compass that points to areas in which we have an emotional state. It's a really valuable experience once we learn to understand what it is and how to use it. All these negative emotions play important roles for us, and implementing them in a practice is much more behavioral than an intellectual exercise. This is not something that we learn in our heads. This is something that we have to go through for a long time. We've been teaching younger people for about 10 years to fear failure, to work towards concrete assessment. It's like you're not going to sort of snap your fingers and have this change overnight. And so one of the things that I did that was kind of smart was say I want a whole class, so I got like 15 weeks to work on these things. And that's actually about the right amount of time to conquer some of these. Anyway, not to talk about that class just yet. Some of the people that I interviewed that are here are going to have the very weird experience of having me quote them while they're sitting here. So there it is. So Matthew Bourbon has discussed this kind of conflict talking about his process. And here he says, there are times when the process feels great, times when it feels terrible, when I have come to realize that it's all part of the arc of making something. Perhaps our nagging critical side that always wants more from the work and is never satisfied is what inevitably keeps one from getting stuck, because it forces you to reach further for what is always outside your grasp. That said, while there are certainly points of struggle and frustration that can be quite painful and difficult, I'm so deep into the concentration of the painting process that it always seems like there's a next step. I never get stuck for long because there's always a path leading off somewhere. So reading carefully between the lines, and that quote's in the book, if that went back kind of fast, you can get the book and read it. But reading between the lines, you can see that he's talking about the value of certain kinds of anxiety and experiences of anxiety and failure. So people have asked me, going back to my earlier, people have asked me, what's the one thing that you've learned that would make the biggest difference for the artist? Well, I actually have kind of an answer for that. It would be this: successful artists are by and large not focusing their energy on creating specific works. Instead, they are investing in maintaining a practice out of which artwork periodically emerges. In short, they're focusing not on the seed, but the soil. Was overhearing Caroline Kent talking the other night about her show, The Carmen Line at St. Kate's. Great question popped up. I don't know if you remember this, Caroline. Somebody asked about practice. You kept using the word practice. And somebody said, well, what do you mean by this weird word practice? Why don't you just talk about artwork? And so I'm paraphrasing here, but you said that your practice was everything that you did that was related to your art. And that included reading, watching movies, writing, thinking, studio work, and so on. It was all part of what you do. And so you connected it to that. So that's a bit of what I'm talking about, creating an environment out of which artwork periodically emerges. I think Marjorie Ender's show, the Undercover show that she just did at Augsburg, is another really good example of how this works. The one gallery has a large installation, the other had a lot of experimental projects and support materials. But within both galleries, one of the things that you see is wide-ranging experimentation as ideas are continually reinterpreted and reinvented. 2 ideas become 3 dimensions and then back into 2 dimensions, and then reimagined as new materials are brought into the studio. Both exhibit suggest an approach to making that is very fluid and ongoing, with an emphasis on forward momentum rather than discrete objects. There is a bit of paradox in this process, in that while artists are clearly hoping to make art, they do this most often not by focusing tightly on that goal, but by seeing it as one part of an overall arena of activity. The way that gets translated into making art is often oblique and indirect, and supported by a lot of process work and experimentation. Frankly, a lot of it can look very inefficient from the outside. Often these activities include other professional things. Janine Nagy has noted about her career. She says, I definitely wear multiple hats in my different roles as artist, educator, and curator, but they are all linked. It's been interesting to see how they're all equal, how they all fuel each other. There's an overlap between the studio, the gallery, and teaching. All of these roles allow me to become more motivated to help people learn how to pause and ask questions and see the world in new ways. I think there, it's not so much in the studio, but outside of the studio, again, building a body of ideas and interrelated activities, a critical mass, again, a constellation of things that generate energy, forward momentum, interactivity, and some really productive things. So, these core ideas have defined really my creative practices class. I think I don't want to maybe talk about that because I'd like to have these folks talk more about their practice. The class that I said is still a work in process, but the goals of working to directly address these challenges by creating the kinds of spaces and forms and research discussed here are absolutely, the things that I've done, the things that I discovered, really got translated directly into the class, and frankly, they really transformed the way that I make work myself. So that's been a very profitable thing for me to do. So in spite of all, it's like nothing else comes from this, it helped me. So there we go. Sometimes, like most of the things that I do in my life, I find the hardest way to do it, and then I take the longest time to do it the hardest way. So there we go. So I want to introduce the panelists that we have here. I don't have time to maybe go through a lot of their work. I have 4 images by each of the people, and maybe I'll introduce you, and then you can all sort of like rush up to the tables here and fight over the choice seats up at the table. So. Caroline, okay, here we go. Caroline Kent lives and works in Chicago, Illinois. Working within expanded strategies of painting, her practice explores how language is constituted, comprehended, or functions in a third space. Using a personal system of lexicons that include patented forms, patterns, and mark-making strategies, she constructs large-scale paintings on unstretched canvas that hang directly on the wall. A direct reference to the film screen. She has received a Pollock Krasner Foundation grant, McKnight Fellowship for the Arts, and Artist Initiative grants from the Minnesota State Arts Board. So, Marjorie Amdur is from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So Marjorie, this is her show that's currently up at Augsburg. She is an artist whose large constructions of repurposed, exuberantly colored cosmetic sponges have been influenced by dynamic and otherworldly landscapes of Iceland and Australia. Her work engages questions about passages of time, labor, urban renewal, and geometry within natural landscapes. Amdur's work is included in multiple permanent collections, including the U.S. Embassy in Paramaribo, Suriname. Marjorie teaches at Rutgers University. Janine Nagy, who's showing here just up on the gallery upstairs, lives in Riverside, California. Her work investigates the transformative potential of repetition, how simple materials, actions, and forms can produce something greater than the component parts. She's had solo exhibits at the Portland Art Museum. This is the piece that's upstairs. You got to go see it. It is really nice. Might have to walk away with this one, Janine. Yeah, I don't. Okay, we'll talk. She had solo exhibits at the Portland Art Museum, grants from the Foundation of Contemporary Art, the Oregon Arts Commission, Colorado Creative Industries, and the Ford Family Foundation. Matthew Bourbon is an artist and writer. Recently, he was awarded the Otis and Velma Davis Dozer Travel Grant by the Dallas Museum of Art to conduct research in Japan, and he was named an Institute for the Advancement of Art Fellow at the University of North Texas. He's also an art critic and contributor to Art Forum Online, Flash Art News, New Arts Magazine, Glass Tire, and served for several years as the regional editor for the journal Art Lies. Matthew was a professor of art, recently minted professor of art at the University of North Texas. So I tell you what, why don't our panelists come up, have a seat, and I need to change this over a little bit, and I have a question for you folks. So while these folks are doing this, here we go. These are some of the other participants in the study, and I'm just going to let this scroll. And so these, the images should loop every 10 seconds or so. so we can see some of the other participants, and we'll just let that go. If you get bored with the conversation, you can just look at the pretty images. So. I did give these folks an initial question, so I'll read it here, and then while they're figuring out who's going to answer this first, I'll make my way over there. And this is the first question that I had. Our work as artists is deeply embedded in process. Given that this often includes a significant degree of experimentation, discovery, and development, how do you understand the idea of authenticity and expressive voice? Go.
I think authenticity really comes into play when you have had a practice for a fairly long time and you can reflect back on your process and see as an observer of self, so that over time I know if I tell the truth, which I try to do most of the time, but I don't succeed all the time. When I'm making something in the studio, when something resonates and when it doesn't, or when I'm making something so that it will be accepted as product. And for me, it doesn't. There's a gap. So then sometimes in an evening, I will say, this is done. I can't believe I've done it in this amount of time. I'm going to go out and celebrate. The truth is, I go back in the next morning, and I was kidding myself, and I have to tell the truth, about that. So long-windedly or not, I really just think it is this idea of practice. And I said to Ken that when I learned this, when I did this installation at Augsburg, and I was deep in the middle of caca, and the piece wasn't working, that at a certain time, thank God, there was an aha moment. And so I kept asking myself, what is that aha moment? And what I thought at the time that I said to Ken that I'm still not sure is that a work is done when it mirrors the best part of ourselves. Like, so we know, and we know that truth because we wouldn't be able to think that. Something like that.
I think I'll answer next. Listening to you, you mentioned something that's, I think, really important, and you mentioned that time, the factor of time and thinking about authenticity. I think how I kind of thought about your question was that if there is something what the thing is at stake for you to make a thing and put it in the world and put it out there, and what is at stake for that thing to be in the state that it's in, I think that's the closest thing I can think of as authenticity. And I think it does take a long time because you can put things out there and you might still have questions. And I think that kind of understanding what is at stake for you to do a thing is kind of tied to the kind of questioning you're doing and the kind of inquiry you're doing in your practice. And I think that as you continue to question and inquire, you kind of carve out a space from where authenticity kind of comes from in your practice. So that's why I think there is something really key with time, because I don't think you can always know or maybe be able to answer what is at stake for you to do a thing and put it in the world. I think that comes with sticking with it over time, and then that answer probably shifts and changes. That the thing that's at stake might shift and hopefully deepen, I would assume, or else you would stop, or else there would be some pushback in some way. Caroline.
Marjorie.
Matthew. The question's tough, I think, because I think anytime you're talking about something that's authentic, it's already problematic. Like, how do we determine what is authentic? I think there's the side when you're maybe a young artist where you're kind of trying on hats of other artists in a way, to people you love or you have a kind of affinity with. And anytime you're sort of too close to that, it's deemed inauthentic. Now you're kind of close to those artists, and so now you're sort of derivative. And anytime you veer away from that a little bit, then you get closer to this thing that maybe is supposedly authentic. But really, everything is connected. So there are always these sort of lines of connection to other artists that are in each of our work, and they're connected to different artists, but those are drawn there. And so it's never can really be separated as like this is singly my thing, therefore it is authentic. I think to me, I like your comment about what's at stake in the work, because I feel like that's maybe where there is maybe something that is our own when we can capture, or not capture, but when we can tie our work to what are our actual concerns. And when we feel like the work is connected in some way to those actual concerns, and maybe we are actually doing something that is our own versus too closely connected to somebody else's body of work or their thinking or whatever. So maybe there's some kind of authentic something there, but it seems it's a troubling word for me to think about in my own work, where that sits. I think the line is sort of gets blurred depending on where your work lands. So.
Hi, I'm Janine. I was interested in this question because I feel like I don't put that language around my work, but I do around my students. So that was a nice little check-in moment for me. And I think that just to kind of, reiterate what everybody has already said, this idea of time is definitely very valuable. And that made me think of what you had talked about with this idea of just showing up to the studio and what that is. And I think that what you talk about with regard to showing up to the studio and making the work and because it's an imperative as opposed to a product, that's I think where it really resonates for me, where my work happens because there's just no other choice. So maybe that's for me where the idea of the authentic comes in.
Great answer. So thank you. So we have some microphones around, right, Carrie? I do have, I got more questions here, but I actually kind of like to hear from you folks. So feel free to lob a larger question towards the group or a specific one towards individuals. So who has one?
So are you thinking like questions in terms of creative practices across the board? They can ask anything about a process or someone's like what?
Sound nervous.
No, I'm just curious, like if people might want to know the parameters.
Okay, that's maybe a good point, because
Maybe I want to know the parameters.
I've had people ask me some pretty wacky stuff when I'm standing in front of a group of people. So yes, maybe we could limit it to creative process practice with this group of individuals. How does that sound? Okay, there we go. And while you folks, anyone? Okay, I've got more questions. If you don't, anyone? Oh, up here. Okay, please.
I think this is working. Well, I have read the book a little bit, and you touched on this idea of, I think, embodied knowledge in the book. I think that was the term you used. And I'm just curious, I'm thinking of the way that you used in the book, talking about these kind of extracurricular or outside of the studio practices that artists engage in that are related to the practice, but not necessarily the practice. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of curious with the group up there if they could, talk about what that looks like for them.
Ooh, that's good. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
As Ken mentioned, I also, besides making artwork and teaching, I also have a curatorial practice. And I am a little hesitant to say that I'm a curator in the traditional sense, where mostly I feel like I'm more of a facilitator for opportunities for people. And since the beginning of my time doing this, I've been doing these kinds of things since '06. I had a small experimental artist-run space in Portland for a few years, and now serve as a gallery director for an academic institution in Los Angeles. And I've always put shows together that have kind of been explorations of things that I had been thinking about in the studio for myself. And in the very beginning, that looked like how people used space. So my earlier work was all installation-based and built on site, and that comes with a whole host of problems and complications and challenges and rewards. and I was just always like, am I doing this right? Or like, what the hell? Like, this is just crazy business. And so I would always invite people to build work on site and see just like how they solve that as a problem. So I think that that's something for me, like I use it as research basically. And in terms of like the shift of my work, now I make these black squares that are what I consider discrete objects that I make in the studio. That stems specifically from a project that I had worked on that I curated for a space in Portland called Disjecta, and that was with the artist Peter Halley from New York, who's a hard edge abstraction painter. He's worked for many years, and he did this huge, gorgeous, amazing installation that was essentially one painted wall and a wallpaper, and every other surface in the gallery space was wallpaper. And a lot of his paintings, I think, deal with space, but in a perceptual way in terms of like warm and cool colors and making these very flat abstract shapes, have depth to them. And I was just curious about that as like an optical phenomena, and then that became this like translation of that optical phenomena through material for me, and that's where like the use of the graphite came in, and the exploration of drawing, and the idea of like the act of drawing, and as opposed to making a picture, and all of that just came from that experience working with him. So.
For me, the idea of embodied knowledge, I guess, is this sense that everything around your practice that is not discreetly your practice is feeding you. It's like giving you information. You're taking that stuff in, and it's giving you the opportunity to then hopefully make something interesting. Not necessarily directly out of that stuff, but it's sort of like interesting people can make interesting work. And if you're not taking in interesting things and becoming an interesting person in your own sense of who you are, because you're exploring great novels and looking at great movies and all the other stuff, then maybe your opportunity to sort of make something interesting is a little bit less. So maybe that embodied knowledge thing is sort of this way of just sort of feeding ourselves, so that when we show up in the studio, maybe there is this opportunity for something to happen, and we can maybe get out of our way a little bit and just let it sort of come out of us more than direct it so much, because usually our sort of directed things are maybe a little less interesting, probably.
Well, one thing, if I could just maybe add a follow-up here, Matthew, because when I think about how you have talked about in your practice, you actually have a database of several thousand images, and you have talked about your process where you go back and you're sort of constantly kind of scrolling through those. The show that you have at Bethel, you pulled out about 30 or so images that related to the specific work that you have there. And when I think about that database of images, these are not just sort of random things. These are things that you're filtering through pretty regularly. And so as you're filtering through, you're creating a relationship to them. They're getting lodged in your memory, and it starts to become another part. In addition to what you're talking about, I really see that as being a bit about embodied knowledge. It's not just about factual information. It's not just painting data. It's actually like, putting one image next to another. It's like, wow, that's interesting what's happening with these two. So I see like that database as being partly that as well.
Yeah, there's a kind of intuitive thing that happens after you absorb so much information. We all will gravitate towards our own kinds of things that interest us, and that again somehow feeds the process. I'm also a writer, so I do write art criticism, and so that putting on that hat, you're thinking about another artist's work and trying to figure out how they approach it, and that may be very different than how you approach what you're doing. And so you learn about yourself in contrast to that sometimes, or sometimes in affinity to it. But that's the same with just maybe that database, the sense that you're sort of exploring images and their relationships, and a kind of poetic pinball machine or something in your head about how all this stuff can fit together, which is not direct. It's not codified in some easy way. It sort of can, fly in lots of different directions.
You mentioned something when you were talking. You said interesting people, and I think conversation is one of those things that kind of, it's not in the studio. It doesn't happen there, but it comes back to that place. And and in my lifestyle, there are many times throughout the week when there are different people over visiting, whether it's to hang out, have dinner, and those conversations become really important, and they're always I mean, they're critical conversations most of the time, whether if it's about pop culture or if it's specifically about contemporary art, or if it's about teaching and education, politics, those things. And I think that the residual effect of that becomes really important in the studio practice. As I remember parts of conversations and I remember some of the dialogues that happen, I think for me that's a huge part that doesn't happen specifically in the studio, but that is definitely shaping the way I think about my practice and teaching and those things.
I go shopping. No, it's not really. Well, yes, really, but not. Anyway, I do think I also agree with what everybody has said so far. And I think for myself, this traveling and stepping outside of my everyday world is an opportunity for me to refresh. And the conversations, I said something today, one of the reasons I give talks or I like to go and be a visiting artist is I still get nervous, like you were saying, Ken, and I talk and then I hear myself say something, like it's like out, you know, and then it's like, okay, you know, is that really so or not? And it also creates pause. And I heard myself say something today, which was, I didn't say exactly this first part, but I think we all are kind of like we go on an archaeological dig, and we're so fortunate to be able to have found a way to dig into what we're each invested in. And somehow doing what we do, I need to manifest something visually. The bottom line is I need to manifest something visually. And I wish that I could say a conversation is enough, but through the manifesting something visually and hopefully well enough, I then get to participate in these kinds of conversations. So sure, I would like every so often to sell something, and I would like to have it work visually. But this is, for me, is where I get the greatest satisfaction and feel like life is good. So my art hopefully produces this kind of interaction or supports this, something like that.
Just to follow up to what both of you ladies had just said, I totally agree with that as well. And it just made me think of something just recently. One of my colleagues, I teach at a school in Los Angeles, and my colleagues they're very invested in the commercial gallery scene and what that looks like for them and how they position themselves in that. And when I was saying to somebody that I was coming here for this, they're very kind of interested and intrigued. And my one colleague had said, "Oh, I haven't had a show outside of a commercial gallery in 8 years," and I just thought I'm so sorry to hear that. That just it just seems like this is totally the meat of it for me too. And to think to not engage with that or to not even know that that's an opportunity, or I go to weird places that I would never go to. I've been to super tiny towns all across the country out of the kindness of these kinds of opportunities, and it's so enriching and interesting and great. So I just wanted to say that. So.
Great. I think we maybe have a question over here. I think you have to wait for the mic.
So Ken, you mentioned spaces where the artist is free to make work free from observation. And I was just curious what you guys would say about the role of critique in your artist process and sort of when to invite other people into that, knowing when your work is ready or when to kind of hold back and let it sit.
That is a great question. Yeah. All right. Who wants to start? Yeah. Okay.
People are always invited. That may or may not be a good thing, but I take it when I can get it, and I am not in a situation where people are breaking down the door to come to have a critique with me. So people are invited, and sometimes people, unexpectedly wander in that wouldn't necessarily be there for critique and ask questions, and outside of that that framework. So people come whenever to my studio.
So for critique or for conversation, or how does that sort out?
I feel like those are the same for me. I don't. Yeah, I would say that's the same for me. So, I mean, as opposed to, where that might be different would be like a curator coming over, and that's a different kind of situation where the reason why they're there and what the expectations are for them and for myself, and that feels a little bit more of a specific, formal, professionalized experience.
So I've found that as I've gotten older, that I am more protective of certain time. And I was at a residency this summer for a month, and I noticed you could either keep your door, if you kept your door open, that meant people could walk through. If you kept your door closed, you don't knock, really. So I noticed for the first week, and then I thought, people were going to think I was a snob, But for the first week, I needed to keep my door closed. And there clearly came a time when I could say, come through, and feel I would be fine, or the work would be fine, or I would be able to try things on for size. But I had to know when I was grounded enough to be able to be open yet feel safe, I guess, something like that.
There was one of the people that I interviewed, Lori Fredette. She's out on the East Coast. She had a quote that I really liked. She said, "I'm very imprintable, and so I have to be careful when I bring people into this studio." And I want to be careful here to respect the different things that people are saying. But I would say, Marjorie, just what you said is actually probably among everybody that I talked to, because I talked specifically about critiques and asked a lot of those questions. And just how you described it is actually super common. People say, absolutely, but only after the work is so far along that it really can't change course. It's like, I'm going that way. Would you like to help me figure out how to go that way a little better? So. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think maybe if I can think, there might be a couple times, 2 different times when I want critique. But I think there's something key about saying want. It's like there's desire to want feedback. Desire is there. So typically if I start something new and I'm in new territory and I just don't know how to think about it, and I need someone to come in and kind of help me see it, that's the time I usually like and offer someone to come in and critique. And then the other time is typically when I feel like I know the work so well and I need something more. I need it to do something different, and I just need some feedback for that. So maybe like early on and when it's become familiar.
I think there's 2 aspects to critique. There's the critique that one gets as a student, in the sort of years when you're a student, and that is a little more artificial in some ways, and maybe a little more directly critical, maybe. I think as you go on, when you're inviting people into your studio, it's maybe a little bit more genteel in general. I mean, it's more of a conversation than what you might experience as a student. I feel like, to me, it's not so much seeking someone's opinion to help me figure something out or anything like that with the work. It's more just having people in that I respect as artists or thinkers, and just hearing them talk about what they're seeing, and just to hear what response I get, because it's always different. And to me, that's just interesting to see how people think around whatever you put out into the world. And it's a real pleasure, really, to have people actually consider your work in that way. And so I think it's quite wonderful in that sense. I invite everybody to come to the studio too. But I do think that there is a need for a safe space as well. there's a time and a place for that to happen. And there's certainly a time when I don't want people in the space. And I'm even in terms of like social media and all that kind of stuff. I mean, people are constantly like posting their work on Instagram or whatever. And I will pretty much only post a detail until the work is seen in the show. And then I will post it, because I feel like that's also kind of like some private, that it has to be mine until it's there in its entirety or something. So, I don't know.
I think that, as long as you brought up social media. Sorry. It's so weird to me that when I'm working on new work and you like either show a detail or you post something and then you look for how many likes you get. And if you're so excited about something and oh my God, there's only 3 likes when you wake up. You know, like, I'm such a fuck up. You know, like, what was I thinking? You know, and then something you're unsure about and everybody's like, yeah, I like, and this is courageous, and, you know, you're going like, what? You know, so I think, again, that it still gets back to this notion of being grounded and where is it that you're trying to go, and that self-reflection and just telling, it sounds weird, just telling the truth to oneself. And that sounds like we should be able to do that fairly easily, but I think it's complicated and it takes slowing down to be able to do that. And for me, I would say on that note that my studio, like I'm a person that's like ideas everywhere. And my studio practice is also one that is about slowing down. So I need to manifest that in my life for lots of reasons. But the social practice is really amazing when the likes and how much weight one could put on it.
I mean, back to the student thing, I think I always tell my students that you have to, graduate students, you have to, because you're constantly getting voices as a graduate student, right? People are coming in, they're telling you this, you know, she's saying this is great, I'm saying it's terrible, and whatever. And so you have to know what to let in and when to be open and when to just ignore and say this is not germane to the way I think, and so just whatever, I'm just going to let that go. And the classic story that you brought up with social media and the amount of likes, I constantly think of like when a professor or somebody comes in, a curator or whatever, they come into your studio and all your work is up and it's wonderful and they're talking about it and they're mildly interested, but they really love that little thing in the corner that you've sort of tried to hide, you know, because it's just the thing you do on the side for holiday, but that's what they really love. I mean, that happens all the time, right? And that can be wonderful and eye-opening, or it can just be terrible, and you just have to maybe know when to accept that and maybe bring that into your work and when to just ignore it. You know, it's hard.
Well, I feel like that what you just said goes back to the idea of authenticity, where like you made the thing because you had to make the thing, but maybe nobody else can see it because it's embarrassing or whatever. But maybe that's a true self, you know. So I encourage my students always to pay attention to those things too. And you know, I've had that experience both as an artist and as a curator as well, as like it's rich when that happens, I think so.
It strikes me that the panelists here, for the most part, have avoided some of the dilemmas that I've been talking about with this culture of assessment, and you know, maybe you got a little bit of it, Caroline, but I don't think the rest of us really did. So, but this culture of assessment that we've created in the United States, and so when I think about this question, I think about the class that I teach called Creative Practices. One of the foundational things that we do in this class is we specifically do not critique. We have a lot of conversation about how we don't critique. And so you get people in a group, and it's just like, you know, people around a campfire, they want to start critiquing everything. It's like, no, it's like we're going to develop through talking a different relationship to your artwork. And it's actually, I think that what I find myself doing in that class is actually kind of therapeutic. You know, it's like these people have been beat up for 10 years about, like, everything that they're doing has been constantly assessed and constantly sort of worked over in an environment which, you know, even though it has maybe good intentions and even some good actions and ideas about it, the omnipresent nature of that assessment is overbearing. It's stifling. And so what we do is we actually use this language and use these kind of conversations that some people here are talking about to develop a very different relationship to one's work. It's like once you get that, I think that's a really foundational thing. So, yeah. Maybe you should, yeah. Thank you.
It just occurs to me that the conversation you were having about social media and this idea of assessment actually is very much connected to the idea of assessment in the classroom. So are we putting ourselves in positions of being assessed, even think we're not? And I wonder how that plays out in your studios and in your teaching. This idea of both assessing within critique, but also being assessed in culture.
So the culture of assessment in academia, don't get me started, Ken. I think it's a real problem. It's a really big problem. I think what most artists do is get in a space where they're comfortable not knowing what the hell they're doing. And they're willing to follow that and live in that until they feel like they find some thread that they can pull on for a while. And I think the academic side of assessing is so much about like a cookie cutter. You have these skills, we've measured them, here it is, and there's your outcome. And it feels very antithetical to how, at least for me, how art practice actually is and exists and blossoms in the studio. So if we're supposedly in this position of trying to teach, which maybe we don't, maybe we only coach, but if we're in this role, like how are we actually doing that? How are we fostering that in students and for ourselves if we're in this constant sense of what are we getting out of this? What is the outcome? I don't know what the outcome is. I don't know if it's valuable at all. That's why those conversations are so important. When people are generous enough to actually spend time with what you do, you feel like, well, maybe it is something, instead of just assuming that it's something. And then here's your list of like things you need to check off. So yeah, don't get me started.
As far as social media, I'm not on social media, so I can't speak to that. But with regard to assessment in the classroom, no matter what class it is that I'm teaching and no matter what level it is that I'm teaching, I set it up to talk about what's going to happen here is that we're going to hopefully teach you how to make art as artists and develop this time as a practice, which for foundation level students are like, what are you talking about? But then afterwards they kind of like get into it where I talk about like, well, this is your job and this is the time and day you have to be here, and to have them kind of, you know, embrace it as such. And with regard to assessment, I grade on, you know, whatever the skills are that we're covering in class, but they have the opportunity to rework work up until the very last day of class. And it's shocking to me how many people do not take advantage of that and then are like, but I gotta see. We're like, so I try to like kind of get out of the space of, and you talk about this in the book a little bit, like the idea of talent versus intellects or intelligences, I think, which resonated a lot because I guess I think about that, but without, you know, knowing about how you categorize it, and I just encourage work, and if they put in the work, they get an A, and because they want to get an A. So it's not about like how you know, good, quote unquote, or bad the work is. It's, you know, are you putting in the time? Are you spending the hours? Are you getting the feedback? Are you listening to the feedback and assessing that feedback for yourself and seeing like what you said, like, is this meaningful to me or not? So.
In terms of teaching, I think about assessment a lot. I mean, a lot of things are similar. I think my approach in the classroom is that I'm not like, I don't have the objective of having my students aim for grades. And so I think I don't know, I might even tell them in the beginning, like, I'm not interested. If you want an A, I'm not interested in you just working toward a grade. My objectives are usually about freedom And I think that comes through in the way that I meet with every student and talk to them on a daily basis. I think that consistency of sending that message throughout the course, even after they've done something that they feel like is a failure or missed the mark, because I'm always interested in after a kind of freedom, I think that, I'm hoping that by the end that's reflected in how they feel with the course. Yes, I know I have to hand out a letter grade at the end, but because it's not the focus, I'm hoping that that students are kind of disrupted from thinking about that, and that the repetition of always pursuing students and getting them to take certain kinds of risks or permission, those kinds of objectives in the classroom are just like daily. So, I don't know. I hope that answered the question.
It's harder to do. It's interesting hearing you say these things because I'm thrilled that you're what I'm hearing, but it's so much harder today because the top down and more and more on your syllabi, you have to list this, this, and this. And so I do the listing, and then I covertly, except now that I've said this out loud.
It's recorded. Yeah.
But one of the things I do to get this across fairly early on is I get students given an assignment and I get them really vested, like really vested, and you have to make sure that they're vested. And then I tell them to stand up and to go look at what everybody else is doing, and then I tell them to sit down in front of somebody else's work. And they just like, what? Yeah. And like, okay, you're going to work with the person's materials, and you want to be respectful of what's in front of you and make a contribution. And I can't even tell you, they go out of their minds. Like, I just put 2 hours into this. And I'm like, 2 hours? So what? Like... And they just are so upset. And then I make them stand up, do it again, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe this. I would never have thought of. But anyway, the reason I do that is to just that whole notion of being successful and, having to make a product, it wipes it away. So that's just, that's an example of how to throw it out literally. But it is a very, very difficult, issue, I think, in academia.
I think the social media side is the part that we haven't really addressed, but that idea of being assessed or being evaluated through likes and dislikes or whatever, I think that's the part where, when I was talking about somebody coming into the studio and knowing when to be open and when to ignore stuff, I think you have to have a sense that the value is not coming from anything external. And I think all of us are kind of saying that we value following what we're interested in terms of our thinking about what we're making, or the pathways that leads for us. And then we offer it out, and hopefully it means something to other people. But it's really following that internal instinct that has nothing to do with, this, And unfortunately, there's a lot of this that gets caught up, and people want that sort of dopamine hit or whatever. But I think it's dangerous a little bit for an artist, because you can kind of change what you do based on that, and I think that's really not a productive way to be.
How are we doing for time, Carrie? Maybe one more question? Okay, all right. Up there again.
Thank you. Such a very stimulating conversation. I was wondering how those of you in the panel might respond to the idea of an artist's artist. Is there something inherently distinct about artists' perception of art, or maybe what they value that's different than other audiences?
Yes. I mean, I just think it's artists are in the game. So you know much more because you're in the game. I love music, but I'm not a musician. So I know that somebody who understands music and plays music is going to have a different relationship to it than I do. Maybe not more or less valuable, but different. There's going to be a different kind of depth to that, to what they can understand in a way than what I can. The artist, to me, that's just, you know, it's sort of a backhanded compliment, isn't it, really? It's, I mean, I have those people too who I think are really wonderful, but it really kind of means that they're not well known or something, you know, that it's like the band you love before they got popular or something, you know. And, so I don't know, but I do think there's an intensity that all artists have in relationship to visual art, and you'll constantly see artists like this close to work at a museum or looking at the side, or because we're reverse engineering the thing. We're like, how did they do this? So I can steal it because I want to do it. So I think that's just because you're in the game. You're really like pulling things apart always.
I think everybody in this room is we're like very privileged to be able to even have these discussions. So, you know, I think we have to remind ourselves, you know, of that. So, and you know, I remember the first time I taught a class, and it was at Morehead State University, and I was like, oh my God, I get paid for this? You know, and so having these kinds of discussions, and for me, this is the richest. I mean, I'm perfectly being honest. This is what makes my life good, is having these kinds of discussions. So, but we all are also here in a university, and we're not at survival. So I think there's all these different layers of appreciating art that we constantly have to be aware of. So what is the artist anymore? You know, it's such a expanded definition. But, and what I just think we have to be incredibly aware of who our community is, who our audience is, and being honest.
Thanks. I think we probably have time for one more question.
One last one.
Last one.
I was just wondering if you could talk about a dramatic shift or disruption that occurred in your practice, like a big bump in the road, and how you got past that or absorbed that into your practice and making and studio life.
Well, for me, it was how I had mentioned earlier, this artist, Peter Halley, who I worked with as a curator, and that shifting my work 350%, going from, you know, these large-scale temporary installations that were essentially, you know, big color fields to, you know, the most minimal, most abstract images that I could make. And I was telling one of these guys earlier that there were people who knew me as like the big gigantic color field person, and then now there's these people who know me as the black square person, and those people are always very confused when they see that there's these two things that happen. And I feel like when I look at that work, it's like so clearly connected, but I could definitely see how people are like not there with it at all. And I don't get overly concerned with that perception of things, because I feel like, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's like the work just needs to be made in whatever way makes sense for me at that time. And my lifestyle is so completely different than when I was making these other works that it just seems like that makes sense for me. And, you know, we were talking about a home studio versus, you know, off-site, and, you know, just all these different parameters. And that I feel like that's all what the work is and what it's about. And it makes sense for me that I would be making things that are different than things that I made when I was, you know, a year out of graduate school. So.
To answer your question, I can't think of like some big bump in the road, but I think having a practice as an artist, there are plenty of disappointments. There are plenty of broken expectations. That is like a consistency over and over. And I think it's not that it always like undoes you. It can set you back, but I think that it's a very strange field to be in, that where that's consistent, to where you're constantly putting yourself out there. And I think it's set up that way with artist grants and opportunities. And I think it's unique because I think every time something happens, like a disappointment or an expectation that's not fulfilled in the way you want, or losing artwork in the mail, or it's shipped, tragedies or things like that. I think every time it's an opportunity to kind of remind yourself why you even do this. And you're like, this is ridiculous. Why am I doing this? But, we're in it. And I always tell my students that being an artist is like, this is like the long run. You're in it for the long run. Like, there isn't a destination. Unless you define success with something that you can mark on a calendar and you can achieve and get there, and then it's like, okay, done, then what? Like, it's a long game. And so I find that the disappointments and those things are something that become part of it, and that it is kind of universal. Unless someone here doesn't have any of them.
I'm going to jump in on this one too, because one of the reasons for me writing this book is because, frankly, like all those problems that I talk about, people sort of making work in their head before they go to the studio, pre-imagining outcomes. I am the worst at that. I'm absolutely like the poster child for doing all of that stuff wrong. I'm terrible at it. And part of the reason that I'm so bad at that is because I'm really, really good at fabricating things. It's like I know how to build stuff. And so in a lot of ways, I don't really have to sort of make things to make them. It's like, and going into the studio, it's like, I know how to do this thing. And so for me, the disruption was actually writing this book and realizing that it's like, man, you got this totally backwards. You gotta like change this up. Marjorie, earlier today, you were mentioning Leonardo Drew. He's got a great quote. When somebody asked him, he said, "I don't know what I'm going to be doing tomorrow, but I know where I'm going to be. It's in the studio." And that's kind of how I work now. It's like it really has kind of completely liberated my practice. So if nobody else gets anything out of this, well, I got something. But it really is about changing how I work. And so I'm much more spontaneous in the studio. I work much more from a position of what is the thing that I want to make rather than what is the thing I ought to make.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. So thank you, Ken. Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Janine. And thank you, Matthew. Yeah. We do have books that Ken will sign if you're interested in acquiring one of these very readable, very enjoyable. There you go. Out in our lobby area, and we also have some refreshments. So I hope you'll spend a little bit of time. You can talk to our artists again, but maybe out in that space. So thank you for coming.